August 15, 1945. The day Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio speakers across Japan announcing surrender. But at Camp Livingston, Louisiana, that historic broadcast meant something entirely different for 43 Japanese women who had spent the last 9 months as prisoners of war on American soil. They gathered in the mess hall on a sweltering afternoon, the Louisiana heat pressing down like a heavy blanket, waiting to hear what their surrender would mean for their futures. Captain Elizabeth Morrison stood before them, her uniform crisp despite the humidity, holding papers from the War Department. These women had arrived as enemy combatants, nurses who had tended wounded Japanese soldiers, communication specialists who had transmitted military orders, clerical workers who had kept the machinery of war running smoothly. Now they sat in neat rows, their postures still reflecting the military discipline that had been drilled into them, but their faces showing something Captain Morrison had never expected to see: fear. She began to read the official announcement in clear, measured English, which Haruko Ito translated into Japanese for those whose English remained limited. Transportation would be arranged within 3 weeks. They would be processed through displaced persons facilities in the Pacific before being released to return to their homes in Japan. It was the news they had been waiting for since their capture. Freedom. The chance to return to their families, to rebuild their lives in their own country, to leave behind the strange limbo of captivity. But as Haruko's translation filled the room, something unexpected happened. Instead of relief, instead of joy, several women began to weep. Not the quiet, controlled tears of gratitude, but the desperate, choking sobs of people facing a future they could not bear to imagine. Kimiko Tanaka, who had maintained stoic composure through months of uncertainty, felt her hands begin to shake. Beside her, Yuki Matsumoto pressed a handkerchief to her face, her shoulders trembling. Even Sachiko Yamada, the youngest among them at 22 years old, who had spoken often of her longing to see her parents again, sat frozen with tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Captain Morrison stopped reading, confused by the reaction. In her 3 years of military service, she had overseen the repatriation of dozens of prisoner groups. She had seen relief, anxiety, even anger. But never this profound grief at the prospect of going home. Private Daniel Webster, standing guard near the door, exchanged bewildered glances with Sergeant Maria Rodriguez. They had spent months watching these women transform from rigid, frightened prisoners into something approaching friends. They had shared meals, exchanged language lessons, laughed at misunderstandings and cultural confusions. But this reaction defied everything they thought they understood. What could possibly make someone choose to remain in enemy captivity rather than accept freedom? What had happened in these 9 months that would make going home feel like a greater punishment than staying among their former enemies? The answer lay in a journey that had begun the previous November, when the first transport truck had rolled through the gates of Camp Livingston, carrying women who believed they knew exactly what American cruelty looked like. November 12, 1944. The transport truck rattled through the gates of Camp Livingston just as the sun began its descent behind the Louisiana pines. Inside, 43 Japanese women sat in tense silence, their bodies swaying with each bump in the unpaved road. They had traveled for weeks across the Pacific, processed through facilities in Hawaii and California, each transfer moving them farther from everything they had ever known. Now they arrived at their final destination, a hastily constructed compound on the outskirts of the main prisoner of war facility, separated from the male prisoners by barbed wire fences and armed guards. Captain Elizabeth Morrison watched from the administrative building as the truck came to a stop. She had received her orders 3 weeks earlier, unprecedented instructions that left her equally frustrated and fascinated. Oversee the detention of Japanese female auxiliaries, ensure their safety and compliance with the Geneva Convention, report any unusual developments directly to Washington. The military had no template for handling women prisoners from the Pacific Theater. Everything about this assignment existed in uncharted territory. The truck's rear gate opened with a metallic clang that seemed to echo through the compound. One by one, the women emerged, blinking in the late afternoon light. They wore remnants of their service uniforms, practical gray skirts and jackets that had once been pressed and proper, but now hung wrinkled and stained from the long journey. Some still had insignia pins on their collars, small symbols of the roles they had served. Communications specialists, medical personnel, administrative clerks, women who had believed they were supporting their country's noble defense against Western aggression. Kimiko Tanaka was the seventh to step down from the truck. At 24 years old, she had served as a communications specialist in the Philippines, transmitting coded messages between Japanese command posts. She carried nothing except a small silk pouch tied at her waist containing 3 items. A photograph of her parents standing outside their home in Osaka. A letter from her younger brother written 2 years earlier before he shipped out to Burma. And a smooth stone from the garden where she had played as a child. These fragments represented everything she had left of the life she once knew. The women were instructed to form lines for processing. They moved mechanically, responding to orders in a language most of them barely understood, following hand gestures and the tone of voices rather than actual comprehension. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, one of only 2 female guards assigned to the compound, noticed how they kept their eyes downcast, how they flinched at sudden movements, how their hands trembled despite their attempts to maintain composure. These were not hardened soldiers. They were young women, most in their early 20s, who looked exhausted and terrified. As the November darkness settled over Camp Livingston, the 43 women were led to their barracks. Simple wooden structures with rows of cots, thin blankets, and small footlockers. Kimiko chose a bed near the window, clutching her silk pouch as she sat on the unfamiliar mattress. Around her, other women arranged their few belongings in silence. No one spoke. No one cried. They simply existed in the strange numbness that comes from having your entire world torn away and replaced with complete uncertainty. The first 2 weeks at Camp Livingston passed in a fog of routine and rigidity. The Japanese women rose at dawn, made their beds with military precision, and formed orderly lines for meals in the mess hall. They ate in silence, their chopsticks moving efficiently over the unfamiliar American food that sat heavy and strange in their stomachs. After meals, they returned to their barracks or participated in minimal work duties, folding laundry, sweeping floors, tending a small vegetable garden that had been established for their use. Through it all, they spoke only in hushed Japanese conversations, brief exchanges that carried the weight of everything they could not say aloud. Captain Morrison observed this wall of silence with growing concern. She had expected some resistance, some difficulty in establishing communication. But the level of fear these women displayed seemed disproportionate to their actual treatment. They flinched when guards approached. They refused to make eye contact with American personnel. During the daily roll call, they answered in barely audible whispers, as if speaking too loudly might invite punishment. Something deeper than language barriers separated these women from their captors. Kimiko had been taught what to expect from American soldiers. The propaganda she had absorbed during her service painted vivid pictures of cruelty and barbarism. Americans tortured prisoners. They showed no mercy to the weak. They particularly despised Asian people, viewing them as less than human. Every interaction with the guards felt like waiting for violence that never quite arrived. The disconnect between expectation and reality created its own kind of torture, a constant state of anticipation that left her exhausted and confused. Private Daniel Webster noticed the fear more than most. At 21 years old, he had grown up on a small farm outside Valdosta, Georgia, where his parents had taught him that treating people with basic decency was not negotiable, regardless of who they were or where they came from. He had been assigned to Camp Livingston after training, disappointed to miss combat, but determined to serve honorably in whatever capacity the military required. Guarding Japanese prisoners had not been what he imagined when he enlisted, but he approached the duty with the same straightforward kindness he would show anyone. He began with small gestures. When he noticed that one of the women, a slight figure with a persistent cough, seemed to be struggling in the cold November mornings, he brought an extra blanket without announcement, simply placing it on her cot during inspection rounds. When he saw Kimiko shivering during evening roll call, he moved the formation to a spot that blocked the worst of the wind. These actions were not dramatic or particularly heroic. They were simply the instinctive responses of someone who recognized suffering and felt compelled to address it. The women noticed. They whispered among themselves in Japanese, trying to understand why this young American guard showed concern instead of contempt. Yuki Matsumoto, who had served as a nurse and understood the universal language of caregiving, began to watch Private Webster carefully. His gestures contradicted everything she had been taught about American soldiers. It was unsettling. It was confusing. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to crack the foundation of certainty upon which her entire worldview had been built. December brought colder nights to Louisiana, and with them, the first real breakthrough in the invisible barrier separating captors from captives. Kimiko Tanaka had been declining for days, though she tried to hide it. The persistent cold she had developed during the transport from California had settled deeper into her chest, leaving her weak and struggling to eat. She forced herself through daily routines with stubborn determination, refusing to show vulnerability that might be interpreted as weakness. But Private Daniel Webster had grown up watching his mother nurse sick animals and ailing neighbors. He recognized the signs of someone pushing themselves beyond their limits. On a particularly cold evening in mid-December, as the women returned from their work duties, Webster made a decision that violated several protocols. He walked to the mess hall and found Cook Benjamin Thompson, a large man from Baton Rouge, who ran the kitchen with efficient authority. Webster explained what he needed, and Thompson, after a moment of consideration, nodded his agreement. Some things transcended regulations, and basic human compassion was one of them. An hour later, Webster approached Kimiko's barracks carrying a small ceramic bowl covered with a cloth. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez accompanied him, as regulations required male guards to have female supervision when entering the women's quarters. The other prisoners watched with suspicious wariness as Webster stopped beside Kimiko's cot. She looked up at him with exhaustion and confusion in her eyes, her body tense with anticipation of whatever punishment or humiliation this interaction would bring. Webster held out the bowl. Inside was something his mother had made whenever he fell ill as a child: banana pudding. Not the elaborate dessert served at church socials, but the simple version his family could afford. Sliced bananas layered with vanilla wafers and a custard his mother made from eggs, milk, and sugar. Thompson had prepared it using Webster's stammered instructions, adding his own Louisiana touch with a hint of vanilla extract and a sprinkle of cinnamon. Kimiko stared at the bowl, not understanding. Webster gestured for her to take it, using exaggerated motions like offering food to a frightened animal. When she still hesitated, Sergeant Rodriguez spoke in slow, simple English. "Food, for you, to help." She mimed eating and pointed to Kimiko's chest, then gave a thumbs-up gesture. Slowly, Kimiko accepted the bowl. The warmth from the custard seeped into her cold hands. She looked down at the unfamiliar dessert, then back at Webster's face. His expression held no mockery, no cruelty, no hidden agenda, just simple concern. She lifted a small spoonful to her lips and tasted sweetness unlike anything she had experienced in months. The banana was soft and ripe, the custard smooth and warm, the vanilla wafers adding a gentle crunch. It was not Japanese food. It carried no connection to her home or her memories. But it was made with care, offered with kindness. And in that moment, it represented something that shattered every assumption she had carried into this camp. Tears began to fall down Kimiko's cheeks as she took another bite. Around her, the other women watched in stunned silence as their companion wept over a simple American dessert, unable to understand that she was not crying from sadness, but from the overwhelming shock of receiving gentleness where she had expected only cruelty. The banana pudding incident became a turning point that rippled through the compound in unexpected ways. Kimiko's tears had been witnessed by every woman in the barracks, and word spread quickly about the American guard who had shown kindness to someone he had every reason to hate. The gesture created a crack in the wall of certainty that had kept the prisoners isolated in their fear and suspicion. If one American could show compassion, perhaps their propaganda-driven assumptions about all Americans deserved reconsideration. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez seized on this moment of softening. A second-generation Mexican-American from Texas, she understood what it meant to navigate between cultures, to be viewed with suspicion because of her appearance or her family's origins. She had joined the military partly to prove her American loyalty, but she had never forgotten the sting of being treated as perpetually foreign in her own country. These Japanese women triggered something in her, a recognition of shared experience that transcended their official roles. As guard and prisoner, she began conducting informal English lessons during the women's free time in the evenings. At first, only 3 women attended: Haruko Ito, who already spoke some English from her university studies, Sachiko Yamada, whose curiosity overcame her caution, and Kimiko, who felt she owed Rodriguez some gesture of gratitude after the pudding incident. Rodriguez kept the lessons simple and practical. Greetings, basic requests, names for common objects around the compound. She used drawings and gestures, making the sessions feel less like formal instruction and more like friendly exchanges. Within 2 weeks, attendance had grown to 15 women. They practiced pronunciation, giggling at their own mistakes in a way that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. Rodriguez encouraged them to teach her Japanese phrases in return, creating a genuine exchange rather than a one-sided imposition. The women taught her how to say, "Good morning, thank you," and "Please excuse me." They corrected her tonal mistakes with increasing confidence, their fear gradually replaced by something approaching ease. Cook Benjamin Thompson contributed to this transformation in his own way. He began modifying meals to include rice prepared in a style closer to what the women were accustomed to, rather than the thick, sticky American version they struggled to eat. He asked Haruko, through Rodriguez's translation, about Japanese cooking methods and ingredients. Though he could not replicate their traditional foods with available supplies, he could show respect for their preferences. Small adjustments, less salt in certain dishes, vegetables cut in particular ways, tea served at the end of meals instead of coffee. Corporal James Chen, a Chinese-American guard from San Francisco, found himself in a complicated position. His parents had fled China during the Japanese invasion, carrying stories of atrocities that made him initially resistant to showing any warmth toward these prisoners. But watching Webster and Rodriguez interact with the women forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. These young women were not the soldiers who had devastated his parents' homeland. They were individuals caught in circumstances larger than themselves, just as his own family had been caught in the chaos of war. February 1945 brought news that would shatter whatever fragile peace the women had begun to build within themselves. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Japanese-occupied territories, reports began filtering back to American newspapers about what they were discovering. Stories from liberated prisoners of war camps, accounts from civilian populations who had survived Japanese occupation, photographs that documented atrocities in Manila, testimonies from Burma, evidence of systematic cruelty that made the women at Camp Livingston confront an unbearable question. What had they truly been serving? Captain Morrison made the decision to allow the women access to American newspapers, believing they had a right to understand what was happening in the war they had been part of. The camp library became a place of reckoning. Yuki Matsumoto was the first to encounter the reports, her nursing background making the medical descriptions of prisoner mistreatment particularly vivid and horrifying. She read about Allied prisoners denied medical care, about civilians murdered in occupied territories, about comfort women forced into sexual slavery. Her hands shook as she turned the pages, each new revelation feeling like a physical blow. She found Kimiko in the barracks and silently handed her the newspaper. Kimiko's English had improved enough to understand the articles, and as she read, the world she thought she knew began to collapse. She had believed she was serving her country's defense, that Japan was protecting itself against Western aggression and colonial ambition. But these accounts painted a different picture entirely. One of systematic brutality, of conquered populations terrorized, of cruelty that went far beyond military necessity. Other women gathered around as the newspaper passed between them. Haruko translated for those whose English remained limited, her voice breaking as she read aloud descriptions of massacres in Nanking, of death marches in the Philippines, of medical experiments conducted on prisoners. Sachiko Yamada began to cry, pressing her hands over her mouth as if she could physically hold back the horror of what she was learning. These were not enemy propaganda lies designed to demoralize them. These were documented facts, corroborated by multiple sources, impossible to dismiss or deny. The women spent that evening in almost complete silence, each wrestling with her own private crisis of understanding. They had worn their uniforms with pride, believing they were contributing to something honorable and necessary. Now they had to confront the possibility that their service, however indirect, had supported actions that violated every principle of human decency they claimed to value. The cognitive dissonance was nearly unbearable. How could they have been so blind? How could they have believed the propaganda so completely? What did it mean about who they were as people that they had served such a cause? Kimiko sat on her cot that night, clutching the silk pouch that contained her family's photographs and her brother's letter. Her brother had been sent to Burma 2 years earlier. She had not heard from him since. Now she wondered what he had done there, what orders he had followed, what role he had played in the atrocities she was reading about. The brother, she remembered, had been gentle and kind, someone who cried when their childhood dog died. Could that same person have participated in the cruelty described in these newspapers? Spring arrived in Louisiana with an explosion of wildflowers and humid warmth, but for the women at Camp Livingston, the season brought no sense of renewal. News from Japan painted an increasingly bleak picture of what awaited them upon repatriation. American bombing campaigns had devastated major cities. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, all had been reduced to ash and rubble. Millions were homeless, starving, struggling to survive in the ruins of what had once been their communities. Kimiko received her first letter from home in early April. It had taken months to reach her through Red Cross channels, and the envelope was worn and stained from its long journey. Inside, her mother's handwriting was shakier than she remembered, the characters formed with obvious effort. The letter was brief and carefully worded, aware that military censors would read every line. Her father had died during a bombing raid in March. Their neighborhood in Osaka no longer existed. Her mother was living in a shelter with dozens of other displaced families surviving on rationed portions that barely sustained life. Most devastating of all was the final line, written in characters so faint Kimiko had to hold the paper to the light to read them. "Do not hurry back if you are safe where you are." The words felt like permission and abandonment in equal measure. Her mother was releasing her from the obligation to return, but that release carried the crushing implication that there was nothing to return to. No home, no father. A mother who could barely feed herself, let alone support a daughter marked by the shame of capture. Kimiko sat in the barracks, holding that letter for hours, unable to cry, unable to move, unable to process the magnitude of her loss. She was not alone in receiving such devastating news. Yuki learned that her family's home in Tokyo had burned completely. Sachiko discovered that her father had been killed in an American air raid, and her mother had succumbed to illness shortly after. Of the 43 women in the compound, only 11 had received any communication from family members at all. The rest existed in an agonizing limbo, not knowing if their loved ones were alive or dead, if there was anything left of the lives they had known before the war. The psychological impact was profound. These women had endured captivity by holding on to the belief that eventually they would return home, that their suffering had an end point, defined by reunion with family and familiar surroundings. Now that certainty had dissolved. Home was not a place waiting for their return. It was a concept that no longer existed in any meaningful form. The Japan they would be returning to was a defeated, occupied nation, where they would carry the double shame of military service and capture by the enemy. Captain Morrison watched the women struggle with this new reality and found herself facing an ethical dilemma she had never anticipated. What was the humane response to prisoners who no longer had homes to return to? What did duty require when repatriation meant sending people into devastation and uncertainty? She had no answers, only growing unease about the official procedures that treated repatriation as a simple administrative matter rather than a profoundly human question. May brought an unexpected development that would crystallize the transformation occurring at Camp Livingston. Cook Benjamin Thompson approached Captain Morrison with a proposal that was both simple and radical. He wanted to prepare a special meal for the Japanese women, something that went beyond basic sustenance to acknowledge them as human beings deserving of dignity and care. Morrison listened as Thompson explained his reasoning in his slow Louisiana drawl. These women had lost everything. They faced an uncertain future filled with shame and hardship. The least America could do was show them that compassion existed in the world, that not all their memories of captivity needed to be defined by loss and fear. Morrison approved the request, authorizing Thompson to use supplies that went beyond standard prisoner rations. Thompson spent 2 days planning and preparing, consulting with Private Webster about what had worked before. The answer was obvious: banana pudding. But this time, it would not be a single bowl offered to one sick woman. It would be a proper dessert made with real ingredients, served to every woman in the compound as a deliberate gesture of recognition and respect. Thompson worked through the night before the meal, preparing his grandmother's recipe with meticulous care. He used real vanilla extract, fresh bananas shipped from Central America, eggs and milk from local suppliers, and vanilla wafers he had requisitioned specially. The custard had to be smooth and perfectly sweetened, the bananas sliced at just the right thickness, the layers assembled so that each serving would have the proper balance of textures and flavors. This was not mess hall efficiency. This was cooking as an act of communion. The women entered the dining hall on May 10th expecting the usual plain fare: rice, vegetables, perhaps some meat if supplies allowed. Instead, they found tables set with care, and at each place, a bowl containing something that looked almost too beautiful to eat. The banana pudding gleamed under the dining hall lights, topped with a swirl of real whipped cream and a single vanilla wafer standing upright like a small flag of truce. Kimiko sat down and stared at her serving, remembering the night months earlier when Private Webster had first offered her this strange American dessert. Then she had been sick and frightened, unable to understand why an enemy would show her kindness. Now she understood that the pudding represented something larger than food. It was an offering of human dignity, a statement that despite everything, despite the war, despite the propaganda, despite the atrocities and the suffering, they were still people deserving of sweetness and care. She lifted her spoon and tasted. The flavor was exactly as she remembered: smooth custard, ripe banana, the gentle crunch of vanilla wafer. But this time, the tears that fell were different. Not the shocked, confused tears of that first night, but something deeper and more complex. Gratitude for unexpected mercy, grief for everything lost, and beneath it all, the faint, terrifying possibility of hope. Around her, other women ate in silence, many crying openly, unable to articulate the emotions that this simple dessert had unlocked in their carefully guarded hearts. The official announcement came on May 22, 1945, 2 weeks after the special meal that had left such an unexpected impact on the compound. Captain Morrison assembled all 43 women in the main hall, her expression carefully neutral as she prepared to deliver the orders from Washington. The war in the Pacific continued, but plans were already underway for eventual repatriation of all Japanese prisoners. Transportation would be arranged. Processing would begin within 60 days. They would be returned to Japan through displaced persons camps, then released to make their way to whatever remained of their former lives. The announcement should have brought relief, perhaps even joy. Instead, it brought a heavy silence that pressed down on the assembled women like physical weight. They had known this moment was coming, had discussed it endlessly among themselves in whispered Japanese conversations. But hearing the reality stated in official terms made it impossible to avoid the choice that had been forming in their minds for months. Return to devastation and shame, or somehow find a way to remain in this strange place where they had discovered unexpected humanity. Kimiko Tanaka stood slowly, her legs trembling with the audacity of what she was about to do. She had rehearsed the words with Haruko's help, practicing her pronunciation until she could speak clearly despite her nervousness. In careful, deliberate English, she addressed Captain Morrison directly. "Captain, please, may I speak for some of us?" Morrison, surprised but curious, granted permission. What followed was an outpouring that violated every protocol, every expectation, every assumption about how prisoners of war were supposed to behave. Kimiko explained that 14 women had been meeting privately, discussing their futures and the impossible choice they faced. They had written letters through the Red Cross, trying to locate family members. Of the 14, only 3 had received responses. 2 had learned their entire families were dead. The others existed in painful uncertainty, not knowing if anyone they loved had survived. Yuki Matsumoto stood next, followed by Haruko Ito, then Sachiko Yamada, and 10 others. They formed a small cluster within the larger group, their decision visible in their unified stance. Haruko, whose English was the most fluent, spoke next. "We know this is an unusual request, but Japan is not home for us anymore. We cannot return to country that did terrible things we did not know about. We cannot face shame of capture and defeat." The American personnel in the room stood in stunned silence. Private Webster exchanged glances with Sergeant Rodriguez, both recognizing the magnitude of what they were hearing. These women were not simply asking to delay their repatriation. They were requesting something unprecedented: permission to remain in America, to build new lives among their former enemies, to choose tomorrow over yesterday. Captain Morrison asked them to clarify their request, and what emerged was a testament to the transformation that had occurred within the compound's fences. These women had found something in American captivity that they had never experienced in their own country: dignity, choice, the possibility of redemption through their own actions rather than through obedience to authority. 25 years after that unprecedented request in a Louisiana prison camp, Kimiko Tanaka Webster stood before an audience at a reconciliation conference in San Francisco. She was 49 years old now, her dark hair touched with gray, her English flawless and unaccented. Beside her on the podium sat a small silk pouch, the same one she had clutched when she first arrived at Camp Livingston in 1944. Inside were still the same 3 items: a photograph of her parents, her brother's final letter, and a smooth stone from her childhood garden in Osaka. She had been invited to speak about the power of small acts of kindness to transform enemies into friends, about how reconciliation happens not through grand political gestures, but through individual moments of unexpected humanity. Her speech that day would be remembered by everyone present, not for its eloquence, but for its raw honesty about the journey from hatred to hope. She spoke about the morning Captain Morrison announced their repatriation and how 14 women made the unthinkable choice to request permission to stay. She described the months of uncertainty that followed, the bureaucratic challenges of reclassifying enemy prisoners as displaced persons eligible for immigration. She talked about the American families who stepped forward to sponsor them, offering housing and support to women who had been their enemies months earlier. The Henderson family had sponsored her, and eventually, she had married their son, Thomas Webster, the younger brother of Private Daniel Webster, who had first offered her banana pudding. Yuki Matsumoto had become a registered nurse, working at Charity Hospital in New Orleans for 30 years. She never married, dedicating her life to healing as a form of ongoing atonement for the suffering her country had caused. Haruko Ito had become a translator for the State Department, helping facilitate communication between America and Japan during the occupation and Reconstruction. Sachiko Yamada had returned to Japan in 1948, carrying with her stories of American kindness that helped convince other Japanese citizens that their former enemies could be trusted partners in rebuilding. But Kimiko's speech focused less on individual success stories and more on the fundamental lesson of their experience. She spoke about Cook Benjamin Thompson's banana pudding, about how a simple dessert had become a symbol of dignity offered freely to people who had no right to expect it. She described Private Webster's initial act of kindness, Sergeant Rodriguez's patient language lessons, Corporal Chen's gradual acceptance despite his family's suffering at Japanese hands. These small gestures, repeated over months, had accomplished what no propaganda or political doctrine ever could. They had transformed understanding at the most basic human level. She concluded by holding up the silk pouch, explaining what it contained and why she still carried it. This pouch reminds me of who I was, a young woman who believed she was serving honor and duty. But it also reminds me of who I chose to become when I was given the chance. America gave me banana pudding when I expected cruelty. It gave me dignity when I expected shame. It gave me tomorrow when I had lost yesterday. That is the legacy of unexpected grace.